so proud of us.
Now get out of here. It's bad luck to see me in my dress.
Oh, come on. You know I don't believe in that stuff. I'll be waiting for you at the altar. The handsome news anchor in the tux, all right? Love ya! There, I said it.
I love you too.
Could she be? Susan! Where are you? Susan! Where have you been?
I think I just got hit by a meteorite.
Oh, Susan. Every bride feels that way on her wedding day. My goodness, look at you. You're filthy. Thank God I have wet ones.
Wow. You're glowing.
Thank you.
No, Susan, you're like really glowing. You're green.
Oh no. Derek!
Oh my gosh! What's going on? What's happening here?
You're all shrinking!
Huh? You're growing.
We'll make it stop!
Get me the government.
Oh! This is impossible! No. This can't be happening. Wait, everybody. It's okay. Have some champagne while we're figuring this out. Dobbs! Derek, help me! Here comes the bride! Oh, Carl, it's her wedding day! Derek? Derek?
Being hurt, Derek.
Thank goodness you're okay. What's happening to me?
Don't panic. Don't worry. Whatever you do, don't rock. What?
Derek!
Sorry, sir.
Who are you people? What are you doing? Stop it! Be careful!
Get your hands off me! Don't you know who I am?
Please!